Hey everyone, welcome back to the On the Side podcast YouTube channel. I'm Jackie London, your host and registered dietitian. And today I am going to be deep diving on the question that we covered this week in the podcast, which is what's your take on the keto diet? What are the benefits and what are the risks? Okay. So what's the keto diet? Keto is a dietary approach in which 10% of the calories that you eat a day are going to come from carbs. 70% or more are coming from fat, and about 20% are coming from protein. The idea behind it is to induce a metabolic state called ketosis and that happens anywhere between 24 to, 48 to even 72 hours after cutting out all carbs whatsoever. And this basically starts when you start a keto plan or any other really low calorie diet as well, because of the decrease, this massive plunge in your body's own insulin levels, which simply happens as a result of you taking in less food overall, or in the case of keto, less carbs overall. And it often creates this or induces this metabolic cascade in which you lose water from muscle glycogen. And you'll use your muscle's glycogen stores first as a means of getting energy from the simplest form, which is glucose. That process alone right there, you're going to get about 3 kilograms of water per 1 kilogram of muscle, which means that right away you will start experiencing loss of weight from water, from your body's own water stores. Okay, let's table that for a sec, but it's important to remember as we go. All right. Since keto was initially studied for pediatric seizure disorders in which children are refractory to medication, meaning they're not responding to the medication treatment, the idea is to have an additional keto dietary intervention to help to mitigate the side effects, the signs, the symptoms of pediatric seizure disorder. So you can see how, this can be incredibly debilitating to feel like there's no possible, there's no possible way of treating seizure disorder, to think that there's some possibility of being able to use both the combination of medicine and a dietary approach can really be liberating for many parents out there. And I also think it's important to remember that there is research on this, and that research does exist. So I do want to be clear that what I'm going to talk about today is primarily around the topic of keto for the sake of healthier adults looking for a weight loss intervention or looking for just an overall healthier pattern of eating. All right. So is the keto diet healthy for adults? Not really. So what happens on a diet where 70% of your total calories have to come from fat is that you're going to limit some really important, really critical, and really delicious, might I add, foods. Okay. It sounds really sexy at first to be able to think about like bacon fried in lard, but ultimately it can be really tough to sustain. So what you have to limit on keto are foods that are going to be low in total carbs, fiber, minerals, B vitamins, antioxidants, the minerals potassium and magnesium, phytonutrients. The intended use of keto was for a treatment, right? So where it showed promise for weight loss is in that very initial phase. And I think that's part of why it's caught on like wildfire for a time, at least. And that can't really be understated in some ways, simply because of the psychological effects of that, right? A lot of us are used to this feeling of like trying something and it just doesn't work, right? Or it seems like it's not working. But really, more sustainable approaches may be beneficial for you longer term. But in the moment when you're experiencing something like, oh, water loss or water weight is coming off me, that can be really motivating for many people, which is why I think it's garnered such a cult following, essentially. But here's the thing. The side effects are real. So first of all, the keto flu, keto breath, basically long-term adherence to keto diet, simply like the literature on that simply does not exist. But in the case where it does exist, in that pediatric seizure disorder realm of research, there are always, of course, going to be long-term complications, including bone loss, organ function abnormalities, micronutrient deficiencies, and gastrointestinal problems. The difference is that in those instances, you're really playing a benefit versus risk game, for lack of a better word, right? Like you're really weighing those consequences against what you're ultimately trying to do, which is put an end to seizures. Okay. So in the case of a healthy adult human, The idea of adhering to a dietary approach that was intended for better health, but actually creates organ function abnormalities, appetite dysregulation, which we'll talk about next, and bone loss and gastrointestinal problems. That doesn't seem worth the risk to me at all, right? Well, just period. Okay. So let's talk about that appetite dysregulation. So a lot of what I hear from people or from keto diet proponents is that this ketogenic state can induce this increase in satiety hormones and decrease in hunger hormones. That happens in the initial phase of this approach, right? But what happens, and again, I think that can be really motivating too from a psychological standpoint, but what happens if you aim to do this for longer than, say, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, is that you have one saltine. And to some extent, you see the exact reverse happen to those appetite suppressing hormones and those and that satiety increasing hormones, right? You find that, in fact, this goes in reverse. You will wind up feeling that you're hungrier than you were at baseline. I think that's a fascinating little nugget that that's within the keto research that also can't really be understated. It's really important to keep that in mind. You will feel hungrier than you did before you started a keto diet. Okay. There's also the exhaustion factor, which frankly, I mean, who needs to feel more exhausted than we do right now? I'm just going to leave it at that. That's all I'm going to say. Why do you need to feel more exhausted, Steve? You don't. Research attributes lethargy and exhaustion to these transient periods of hypoglycemia. In other words, low blood sugar. I like to abbreviate that as LBS. You're LBSing, Susie. Okay. In which your brain is just not receiving enough glucose to literally keep your thinking cap on. The side effect is brief, and most literature suggests that it's a lesser deal by day 4 of a keto intervention. But still, I mean, I can't imagine really feeling like you have the energy to do all of the things if you're really being strict or adhering to a regimented keto plan long term. Okay, so the be all end all question I get all the time: does it help you lose weight? Short term, kinda, probably because of all that water you lost. Long term, not so much. There is evidence on keto, right? But the reason why it appears new for a lot of us, and I think a lot of us are used to hearing it more and more in the last couple of years, I'd say since like 2018-ish, is because there's just not a lot of quality research supporting it. It's like a more extreme version of Atkins, right? And a lot of this is because there's a great deal of limited adherence to keto diets in research, right? Like it's hard to get people to do this for a longer period of greater than 2 years. That's key for anyone who's looking at research findings. You want a dietary approach that you can do for the rest of your life, presumably, right? So anything that's temporary by design or that's only been studied in a temporary capacity means that it will be temporary, and therefore your likelihood of doing this for the long haul is very low. And while for many of us, myself enthusiastically included, the second you tell me something's hard, I'm like, oh, I can do it, right? But where I would not recommend that is because ultimately that can really create this cycle of binge restrict, which is just downright damaging both psychologically and physically. It can have really powerful long-term implications for your metabolic health, but in the shorter term, in the more immediate term, it can have really damaging effects on your state of emotional and mental well-being. You can just feel dispirited. It can be a huge, devastating way to feel is if one day you feel like you're in control and you've got this, and another day you feel like I can't possibly, there's no way that I can do this, and I feel like a terrible, lazy, horrendous, fat slob. That is the worst thing that I could wish. I would not wish that on my worst enemy. I really feel like I don't wish that on you, even though we've probably never met. I feel like there's just so many other ways that we could approach something inclusive rather than attempting to do something really, really hard. To what end, right? If you can't, I ultimately say this a lot, which is that if you can't see yourself doing something for the rest of your life, if your diet would get in the way of a life that is expansive and filled with many options, then it's really ultimately not for you. It's not going to work for your lifestyle. Case in point being, let's say you've decided that you're going to accept a job as a pasta maker in Italy, and you got to leave in a week. Well, if you're following a keto diet, that's going to be kind of hard. right? Like you can't even have too much broccoli or you're off the keto diet, right? So think about it from those terms. If your way of eating is going to limit the way that you want to live, it may not be the approach for you. And you can see why it could be difficult long-term. All right, but let's get into some of the major safety concerns. So, again, if you can't do it forever, it's going to be tough. But I also think that, there's some of the research components of this, which is impaired glucose tolerance, chronic inflammation, and possibly linked back to cardiovascular disease risk. Not to mention something more powerful for many of us in the shorter term, which is that it can ultimately make weight loss more difficult the more you do it. So if you're going on and off, that can make weight loss more difficult long-term. It can create that appetite dysregulation and metabolic abnormality that just no one has time for, frankly. If you're currently taking meds for diabetes management, because I get this question a lot from people who are currently taking diabetes medication or oral hypoglycemic agents, it's absolutely essential that you consult your endocrinologist before you start anything like a keto plan. Some medications will actually require you to have carbs with them. So it may not even be the approach that's best for you. With that in mind, I would say choosing any type of healthier lifestyle approach that is high in quality ingredients, right? From plants, from produce, from seafood, from legumes, beans, peas, nuts, chickpeas, lentils, right? This is, and of course that red meat that and dessert that will also play a role in your everyday meals and snacks, but it's just not going to be the main focus. It's not going to be the mainstay. It's not that bacon wrapped bacon. Okay. That's the kind of thing that we would want to see less of and more of these real whole foods that you're including at more meals and snacks. It doesn't mean never. It just means it's more sometimes. Okay. So the other part of this that I think is to some extent why I've seen a little bit less of the keto craze in 2021 is that when you think about it, it's really disregarding 2021's environmental concerns. If your sole source of nutrients, of calories, is coming from cows or other animals, this sounds a bit more like a prehistoric, survival mechanism. Like we're just going to eat the animals and not really thoughtful or inclusive about the current world that we live in. So just think about it from that standpoint too. There's lots of different ways to get protein, to get additional plant derived or other animal derived and marine derived protein sources that don't include, feasting on the lard of a cow. So I feel like there's plenty of options. There's lots of other delicious things that you can eat. The last and kind of more understated component that I think deserves a little airtime is that you will need dietary supplements for life, for the time period that you are taking, that you're consuming a largely keto-based dietary approach. So why does that matter? Why is that important? First of all, it's really expensive. Anyone who has taken a regular supplements knows that regular regimen of supplements knows that this can be really expensive. But in addition to that, dietary supplements are not overseen for safety and efficacy by the FDA. And that's meaningful because it means that what is printed on a label does not actually have to be what's in the product. If no one is regulating you, if no one's checking you, then you can essentially put whatever you want in there. And I think, especially if you're going to be spending money on something like that, that's really tough, right? Like that's a tough thing to wrap your head around because it means that even if something is great or really working for you in one bottle, if you buy that bottle again, you can't necessarily guarantee that the same things will be in there. Okay. Hugely important, lots of safety concerns around supplements. There's been lots of fraud in this industry over the last decade or more. So I would highly recommend that if on a sidebar, if you are taking dietary supplements, look for a third-party seal of verification. That at least ensures that there's an extra layer of a checkpoint of another organization or individual or lab, a third-party lab that tests the product to ensure that what's in there is actually in there or what they're saying is in there is actually in there. That would be my sort of gold standard request from you, is to look for a third-party verification. Now, that being said, when it comes to keto, think about what that means. If you can't get all of your nutrients from food, right? And lots of us can't for different reasons. And I'm not talking about those reasons. I'm talking about you intentionally chose to cut out lots of other foods for the sake of this one dietary approach. If you're not able to get all of your nutrients from food, then it's likely to not be something safe or sustainable, because ultimately you should be getting at least some of those nutrients from most foods in varying different amounts. And you may need more of other ones from different types of supplements. And I would certainly consult your physician if you are concerned about that. But on the whole, I would not recommend cutting out whole groups of foods or nutrients. Any type of restriction or elimination just begets weight cycling. It begets psychological damage and struggle, right? And it ultimately creates a cycle of living on this hamster wheel of losing weight, then binging, and then restricting again, and then just feeling generally like complete shit, and also like there's absolutely no hope for you, right? Like it can be really, really, it can lead you to total despair. It's depressing. Instead, I would think about where you can include more. Where can you have more plants, more produce, more often? I mean, just on the face of it, the idea that you have to limit certain types of produce in order to stay within this prescribed set of rules that keto sets for you is not only backwards from what we know, from what we actually know from long-term studies in nutrition research, but it also means that you're limited in the things that you can do, in the lifestyle that you can live, and can have these longer term effects to your chronic, to your long-term state of health that can create chronic disease over time, or can lead to chronic disease over time. So really important. Think about where you can do more. Think about where you can include more produce. And I would definitely not recommend a keto diet approach, especially if you're looking for something longer term. So, all right, that's going to be it for today. I would say, all of you, safety first. Let's keep that in mind. Safety first. Think about inclusivity. More is more in 2021. And I will see you next time. I can't wait to see you again. Thank you so much for staying with me today. And I can't wait to deep dive on another topic right here on the On the Side YouTube channel. All right, guys, I'll see you next time.